to start by just by thanking the ones that were participating in things while we were gone in speaking, in running the computer and the slideshow and all that stuff. It was nice to just be able to relax and know that everything is taken care of. And so I thank the ones that stepped up to do that. We had a couple speakers from Winnipeg, which were nice, and so it was nice to be able to have everything there and everything filled. And it is nice to be back, and it is nice to speak to you again. And so as I was kind of looking at what we're going to do over the next year, and in March we're going to start a new series that is going to tie around lectureship and then go throughout the year with that theme. But for February, I kind of have a few lessons dedicated to love, entitled Love Like Jesus. And I think February is a fitting month to talk about love. And so we're going to go through a few lessons through the month to talk about how we can love like Jesus. So today we'll look at the heart of love. Next week we're going to look at the greatest love. And then the week after that, Michael's going to bring us a lesson about loving our enemies. And then the last week of February, Uncle Glenn is going to talk to us about loving our neighbors. And so as we look at these things, we will see how Jesus demonstrated what love looks like. We can see how the love that Jesus showed changed the world of his time, but it's changed the world ever since. And we'll look at how we can love like him, and our love can also then have a huge impact on the world that we live in now. There's lots of things we can do, but when it is centered around love, it becomes very powerful. And so over the next few weeks, we're going to look at this idea of love. And so this morning, we'll start with the heart of love here in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Now this is a chapter that's probably one of the most famous sections of Scripture dealing with love. It is a chapter that has been repeated, and sections of it repeated many times. And I'm sure you've heard it outside of just worship services and Bible studies. It's kind of permeated the culture, just our popular culture, outside of just Christianity. One of the most common places we hear parts of this chapter is at weddings, right? When they want to talk about love, a lot of the time in the wedding ceremony, they will quote parts of this chapter. It's common to hear that. And most likely you've heard it at a wedding before. It's a section that people are familiar with. And when they hear it, they may recognize it, and they know that they've heard it before, but may not know kind of its full significance of what really Paul is talking about here, and the point that he's really trying to make. And so this morning we'll look at this chapter and see what significance that it holds. And so when we want to look and see the significance of something in Scripture, it's really good to kind of look at the context of it and see what was talked about before and what was talked about after. So to do that, we need to look at chapter 12 and chapter 14 to fully understand what Paul is speaking to in the church in chapter 13. So a good way to look at this is to think of this as a sandwich structure, where chapter 13 is the meat in the middle that gives us, the flavor and the purpose to the bread of chapters 12 and 14. So it's a good way to look at these three chapters go together, and when we fit it together in that sandwich, it all kind of flows and makes sense within those three chapters. So we can kind of think of it in that way. So let's start in chapter 12. The topic of chapter 12, Paul is dealing with the diversity of spiritual gifts and having those spiritual gifts work together. The church here in Corinth is a young church, and we had a series on Corinth, on the Corinthian church a while ago. And when we look at that church, we can kind of easily look and say, well, boy, they were really messed up. They had so many problems. Look at Paul was writing about this and this and this. And it was easy to look at them and see all the mistakes they were making. But they were a very passionate church as well. They really wanted to do things for Christ, and they were really kind of excited in a lot of their endeavors. And so there was a lot of spiritual gifts that the people in the church in Corinth had. And Paul was mentioning to them about these gifts. And he says in chapter 12, and starting verse 4, he says, "Now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are varieties of service, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who empowers them all in everyone. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good." So Paul recognized in the church that they were having these spiritual gifts. They were using them, but they weren't using them very well together. They weren't being united with it. They weren't understanding that all of these are coming from the same one Spirit, and that they all had to do this within the common good. And so Paul saw that the Corinthians were obsessed with kind of these showy gifts. That they were looking and saying, look what I can do, look at the amazing thing that I can do, and how powerful it is, or how much attention it brings in. And they were ranking themselves on these spiritual gifts. Those with the flashy ones, like speaking in tongues, felt, they would puff themselves up and they were arrogant. And those with quieter gifts kind of felt less important and useless. And so it was causing a big problem within the church. And Paul needed to recognize, and for them to understand, that they are one body. That there's many parts, but one body. And so he says in verse 21, "The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again can the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, the parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And on those parts of the body that we think less honorable, we bestow their greater honor. And our unrepresentable parts are treated with greater modesty, which our more presentable parts do not require. But God has so composed the body, giving greater honor to the part that lacked it." So the church cannot function without different people using different gifts. And all of the gifts were important. No matter how kind of miraculous they may have been, or how popular they were amongst the people that came in to see them, every gift was important. And Paul needed them to remember to be united in these gifts, not be arrogant within them. In chapter 13, and we'll look a little more as we go here, but in chapter 13, Paul wants to express the motive and method for using the gifts. So Paul hits pause on how gifts work to talk about then how they were to use them. So he tells them that it doesn't matter how powerful your gift is, if you don't have love, everything will not function as intended. All the things that you're hoping to get out of these gifts, if you don't have love, you're not going to get what God wants you to get out of them. So he says there in chapter 13, verse 1, "If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but I have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal." He's just saying you're just making noise if you're not focused on love when you're using these gifts. And so he shows them that the gifts are temporary, that these things aren't always going to be around, but love will always be there. And he says in verse 8 that love never ends. So Paul is telling the church, you are using your gifts to show off. But these gifts are meant to show love and to serve, not be a powerful statement of how special you are. And so he expresses that further, and we'll look a little more into chapter 13 of that in a minute. But in chapter 14 then, he brings this practical application of gifts into then their public worship. So now that Paul has established that love is the priority in chapter 13, he applies that rule to specific debates. So he talks about things like tongues and prophecy and these gifts that they were using. And he tells them to pursue love and earnestly desire the spiritual gifts. So don't just look and seek for these spiritual gifts, desiring them, but pursue love first. So he brings up the issue of facing these gifts and their effectiveness. Are they actually doing something? In chapter 14, verse 26, he says, "Let all things be done for building up." There were many in the church that were just doing these things because it got them attention or got them power. But Paul wanted to remind them that they needed to remember that all things need to be done for building up. And so the gifts were not meant to show off so people could see how spiritual you are. They were meant to show love to people, to serve people, to show the power of Christ and build each other up. So chapter 12 says we have different gifts, but we're one body united together. Chapter 14 says when we meet, we should use those gifts to help one another, not to show off. And chapter 13, then, the meat of the sandwich is the why. The only way to grow in maturity is with love. Without chapter 13, the church in Corinth was just a noisy, chaotic talent show. But they needed to make sure they were focused on love. So as we go through this morning, we'll look at how Paul wanted the church in Corinth to understand what true love really looked like and what they were perceived as at the time. And so, as we look at what the church looked like, I want to start with a simple illustration. I want you to look at this gift, and by all accounts, right, it looks really nice. Right? It is kind of this perfect gift. If you walked into a room and saw this sitting on the table with your name on it, you'd be excited. The gold paper is flawless. It looks expensive. It's shimmering under the lights. The red satin ribbon is tied with the kind of precision that promises something valuable is hidden inside. It looks significant, right? It looks like it matters. It looks like somebody really paid attention to it. But as we look closer, we see that the lid is off. And what's inside? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It's just a cardboard box full of air. In 1 Corinthians 13, Paul's looking at a church that is obsessed with the wrapping paper. The Corinthians had a shiny exterior. They had eloquent speakers. They had miraculous knowledge. They had people who could speak in tongues. From the outside, they looked like the most impressive church in the world. But when Paul opens the lid and gives them the hard truth, he says, without love, the box is really empty. You can have the best wrapping paper in the world, the best talent, the best preaching, the best bank account. But if you don't have love, you're just a hollow decoration. You are, as Paul puts it, just a noisy gong. A lot of volume, but no melody. Unfortunately, there have been churches like this throughout history. The church in Corinth wasn't a one-off. There's been churches like this throughout history, and there's churches like that in our world today now. People will look at them from the outside and think they must have the most spiritual leaders and teachers and members. But when they really look at it, many times they'll see greed and corruption and abuse. Now, this is probably a misunderstanding of love, both for the Corinthians and many others through the last 2,000 years. They may think they are doing things for God, but when really looked at it, they're just doing things for themselves. And so the Corinthian church is an example of this, and Paul telling them what they truly need to focus on and what truly is important. So Paul gives the verdict to the church. Finding them guilty of acting improper, he says, and I will show you a still more excellent way. They thought they were doing so good, that they were so spiritual, they were so amazing. But Paul tells them, I will show you an even more excellent way. The church had this vision of what their life as a Christian could be, but they were looking at themselves in a selfish way instead of in a better way. They needed to know a better, more excellent way. Verses 4 through 7 has been repeated in 1 Corinthians 13 many times over. When we look at love, we can look at this and see what love is. It says, love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. This is used to encourage and to remind us of what love truly is. It's important for us to understand the character of love, to look at love in the way God intends it to be. Cultures over the years have made many influences on what love is and should be. These definitions and standards have shifted from time to time and culture to culture. But fortunately for us, God is stable and God is sure. We can know what love is regardless of what our culture says about it at our current time. So one of the things we see is that love is active. In the original Greek, the words like patient and kindness, these are descriptors. These are active words. Love is just not how you feel, but it is how you act. Paul gives these two very positive definitions when starting his description of love. He talks about patience. That love is long-suffering is the idea. Now, long-suffering isn't a phrase that we would normally use all that much, but it's the idea of having like a long fuse or a long temper before becoming angry. We are patient in our love. It takes us a long time until we might get to the point where we boil over. It puts up with people. It's slow to anger. And kindness. Love is active goodness. It looks for ways to be helpful. These are two huge ways in which love shows itself. These two positive pillars of patience and kindness. And are we doing these things really out of love or out of obligation? We need to make sure we are doing it out of love and being active in those things. But Paul also gives us a description of what love is not. And there are 7 negative definitions of what love is not. It says that love does not envy, right? It's not jealous of others' success. It does not boast, doesn't strut around or seek attention. It's not arrogant. It's not puffed up with pride. It's not rude. It cares about manners and other people's feelings. It does not insist on its own ways. It is not irritable, touchy, and easily provoked. It's not resentful. It doesn't keep a record of wrongs. It just deletes the file and goes away. These are attributes to watch out for and make sure we're working on them. We can look at this list and probably at times know of ourselves having all of these traits at certain times. But we need to make sure they do not run our lives. That when we see ourselves acting in one of these ways, understand that we are not acting in a loving manner. So Paul gives us the resilience of love. These 4 alls that love is. He talks about how love bears all things. Love protects. It covers. That love believes all things. It trusts and it looks for the best. That it hopes all things. It remains optimistic about God's work in others. And it endures all things. Doesn't quit when it gets hard. These qualities of love are ones that we can recite, we can remember in song, as we will in a few minutes. The ones that we know, and it can stick with us. Paul needed something for the Corinthian church to be able to recite and to remember, and it works well for us today when we need a reminder of love. It's something that can stick with us. Remembering not just to recite it so we know the words, but remembering to really look at it, to understand what it truly means, and the impact that it then can have. We see then the permanence of love. That love is the thing that will never go away. Paul reminds the church in verses 8 through 13 that even though other things come and go, love will always be there. He says that love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. But love never ends. So all these things that the church in Corinth was getting so caught up in, that the things they were able to do, they forgot the most important thing. And we too can get so caught up in particular things that we lose sight of what it's all about. We can debate and discuss about scriptural and theological things all day. And discuss and debate is healthy. But we need to remember to focus on love. And when we do that, the things that we are discussing become clearer. They become more understandable. They become things that we know we can act upon. Not just trying to be right in whatever issue we are looking at. But we focus on love. Paul then moves on to make sure that the church is going to then mature in their love. Not to just stay where they are. Paul compares life without love to childhood. Valuing gifts over character is childish. Right? He talks about thinking and reasoning like a child. That they value the flashy things over the character. Maturity is realizing that love is the greatest aim. We can get so focused on flashy things when we are young and immature. But as we mature, we focus more and more on love. And that's an important lesson for us. We put away the childish things, realizing that character is the true measure. It can be so easy for us to only focus on making a splash instead of realizing what is really important. The Corinthians needed to show Christ-like love. And when they realize that, the attraction of Christ becomes apparent to everyone. That they see each other face to face. They understand that these gifts that they think are so amazing are great, but they too will pass. And love is what will always stick. So Paul talks about that the greatest is love. He gives these three things. He gives faith, hope, and love remain. With all these things that we focus on, it's important to remember what to truly focus on. Paul saw so many things that was distracting the church. And he needed them to focus on what truly mattered. They were so concerned with being popular, with gaining attention, of being right, that they needed to really focus on what really mattered. They needed to focus simply on their faith and their hope in Christ and on love. When we think of all the things in our life, we need to remember these things. And these things will help us solve everything we do. Instead of getting so distracted with all the things that we are concerned with, when we can just focus on these and focus on love. So as we look at this chapter written to the Corinthian church, we see where our focus needs to be. We do not want to be a church that simply looks flashy and looks all together on the outside, but is a mess internally. We want to make sure that we are using the gifts God gave us, not to further our own attention or power, but to further His work and show His love. We need to be aware of our own selfishness and pride, not allowing it to distract and to take over. There are a lot of things we do in our lives as Christians. And all those things, love is what we need to understand. Paul saw that the church had a lot of promise, a lot of passion, a lot of willingness to work. And so he needed them to remember that love needs to be the center of all of that. To remember why they have the gifts they have and what they're using them for. First Corinthians 13 is a powerful message on love. We have many gifts in the church today. Many people doing great things with the gifts that God has given them. But as we work on those gifts, as we do those things, our focus in all of it has to be on love. We can look at something like feeding our community and say, I brought so many boxes of cereal, or I brought all this food, and I gave it to people because they're hungry. And yeah, they're hungry and they need it. But we need to understand that we gave it to them because we love them. We care for our community. We want to see the best for them. We want them to see Christ in us. So to hear the message of 1 Corinthians 13, not just to hear it as at a wedding for the hope of a couple, but for us to reflect on it, to look at the things that we do every day and on a weekly and monthly basis, reflect on that attitude of love and apply that standard of love that is set out for us every day in our lives. Thank you.